He spent the entire night sitting next to it by the fire, laughing with it, drinking with it, letting it into his home, and he had absolutely no idea. Not until the moment he looked at its face in the firelight and realized, with a cold and crawling certainty, that the person sitting inches away from him was not his best friend. It had his friend's voice, his friend's memories, his friend's name, but those were not his friend's eyes. And by the time he figured that out, it was already inside his house. There is a particular kind of quiet that belongs to the Appalachian woods. Not the peaceful kind, not the kind that invites you to sit down and breathe. The kind that makes the hair on the back of your neck rise without giving you a reason why. The kind that feels less like silence and more like something holding its breath. His name was Jason, and until very recently, he would have told you that kind of quiet was nothing more than atmosphere. Folklore dressed up as feeling. The sort of thing that made for good ghost stories around a fire but had no place in the real world. Jason had grown up on the edge of those woods in Tennessee. His childhood home sat where the tree line began, close enough that the forest was always visible from every window on the backside of the house. He had walked those trees on daylit afternoons as a kid. He had never seen anything that suggested they deserved the reputation people gave them. He was a recluse by nature. Books over bonfires. Indoors over out. The woods had simply never called to him the way they called to others. Then his parents died. Within the same year, both of them gone, he found himself back in that house for the first time in nearly a decade. Back in Tennessee. Back at the edge of those trees. Inheriting the life his father had built there and trying to figure out what to do with it. Going through his father's belongings, he found the old deer post. The hunting equipment. A lifetime of quiet Saturday mornings his father had spent out there with his brothers, decades of a tradition Jason had never been part of. He decided, perhaps out of grief, perhaps out of something harder to name, that he would try it. He would give the woods one chance to show him what his father had loved about them. He had no idea what they were about to show him instead. He went alone. He had reached out to a few friends, but everyone either had plans or had come down with something conveniently sudden. So he packed his father's gear, loaded a moderate amount of ammunition, watched a YouTube tutorial that gave him perhaps 40% of the knowledge he actually needed, and drove out to the post on a cold winter morning with more confidence than was probably warranted. The deer post was exactly where his father had described it. Old wood, worn handholds on a ladder, the kind of structure that had been standing long enough to feel permanent. He climbed up, set his things down, and settled in. Noon came and went. At first the silence felt like an advantage. He could hear everything, which meant he would hear anything approaching before it arrived. He remembers thinking the spot would make a wonderful camping location. The light through the trees was clean, and the cold air was sharp, and everything felt manageable. Then he noticed the snow. Every inch of ground beneath those trees was covered in a perfect, unbroken white. No tracks, no prints. No evidence of anything having moved through there recently. Not a rabbit, not a bird, not so much as a squirrel trail disturbing the surface. Jason did not know much about hunting, but he knew enough to know that a completely undisturbed forest floor was not normal. Something should have been out there. Something was always out there. He told himself the snow must be fresh. He told himself an animal would show up eventually. He almost believed it. Hours passed without a single sign of life. Boredom had never been something Jason handled gracefully, and somewhere in the long afternoon stretch, he found himself reaching for his phone. He scrolled through his contacts and landed on Tony. Tony had been his best friend longer than either of them could clearly remember. They had grown up together, drifted in the way that life forces people apart, and maintain the kind of friendship that survives distance because it has enough history behind it to stay standing. Tony was not exactly the outdoors type. He was particular about his clothes and his comfort, and was not someone Jason would have naturally pictured on a deer post in the Tennessee woods, which is exactly why Jason had not invited him. He texted Tony anyway, mostly out of boredom, describing the trip and the cold and the complete absence of anything worth shooting at. Tony's response made it immediately clear that not being invited had been noticed. He wasn't angry. He was measured about it, but he made his position plain. Next time, he wanted to be asked. Jason agreed, put his phone away, and went back to waiting. The afternoon faded. The light in the trees began to shift, going from clean and white to that particular shade of gray that arrives just before dark in winter. Jason checked the time. 8:30. He had been out there for hours with nothing to show for it. He started packing up, and that is when the sound came. A distant call, breaking the silence from somewhere deep in the trees. Jason's entire body went rigid. His brain needed a full 2 seconds to process that the sound was human, and by the time it did, a second call came. Slightly louder, slightly closer. He pulled himself together. Another hunter, probably. Someone who had gotten disoriented in the dark and needed help finding their way out. It happened. He called out, telling whoever was there that he couldn't hear them clearly and asking if they needed help. The voice called again. He started down the ladder, and then he stopped because the voice had said his name. Not a general call for help. Not a shout into the darkness, hoping someone would hear. It had said Jason. Specifically, clearly, from somewhere in the trees he could no longer see into. He stood at the bottom of that ladder with a shotgun in both hands and thought through his options. Running was not viable. There was not enough light to move quickly through the trees without hitting something. Calling the police felt absurd. What would he say? Someone is calling my name in the woods? So he waited, and after what felt like a very long time, a silhouette appeared at the edge of his vision. It stepped out from behind a nearby oak tree, and it said his name again, in Tony's voice. Jason stood there completely thrown. Tony? Out here? 20 miles from where he lived, having apparently walked through the woods in the dark to show up at a deer post he had only learned about from a text message a few hours earlier? But the voice was right. The laugh when they greeted each other was right. The casual, unbothered energy was right. Tony explained that he had nothing going on and the spot sounded interesting, and he had simply decided to come see it. It was unusual, but Tony had always done impulsive things like that. It was part of who he was. Jason didn't ask about the car. He didn't question how Tony had navigated 20 miles of road and then however long a walk through dark woods without even a flashlight visible. He was just relieved it was someone he recognized. They walked back to the house together. Jason dropped his things inside while Tony started a fire in the backyard pit. He came out with a case of beer and sat down beside him, noticing a smell but not saying anything about it. Something rotten underneath. He assumed it was one of the odd jobs Tony occasionally picked up. The conversation came easily. It always had with them. Nearly a year apart, and they slipped back into their rhythm without effort. The fire crackled. The cold kept everything else at bay. And for the first time since coming back to Tennessee, Jason felt something close to comfortable. They sat in silence for a moment, halfway through the first drink. Then Tony spoke. "Did you ever miss living here, Tony?" Jason went still. "Tony." The correction came fast. Too fast. Overly laughing it off. Blaming the alcohol. Claiming to be a lightweight. Shifting the energy of the moment before Jason could fully process what had just happened. Jason let it go. He talked about missing his parents. About not making real friends in the years he had been away. Personal things. Things he would only say to someone he trusted completely. And all the while something was bothering him that he could not quite identify. Something about Tony's face that was not sitting right. He kept looking and looking away and looking again. It wasn't until close to midnight, when Jason finally announced he was done drinking and started to wrap up the night, that he actually looked. Really looked. The fire had settled into a low, steady burn by then, and the light it threw across Tony's face was direct and honest. And what it showed him made his blood go completely cold. The olive tone of the skin was right. The brown eyes were right. The overall shape of the face was right. But Tony's eyes had a deep ring of green around the center. A heterochromia he had been bragging about since they were children. It wasn't there. The face was slightly too narrow. The nose slightly too long. The chip on the front tooth was on the wrong side. This was not Tony. It was a replica, a near-perfect one, but a replica, and it was sitting inches away from him, looking at him with an expression he could not read. It stood up. It moved so that it was directly in front of him, close enough that he could smell the rot underneath the familiar cologne. Close enough that he could see exactly how precise the imitation was. How many specific details had been replicated, how much effort had gone into making him believe. It asked if he was okay. Said maybe he'd had too much to drink. suggested it should stay the night. Every survival instinct Jason had went quiet at once, and what was left was a single, very clear thought. Do not let it know, you know. He laughed. He made a joke about its breath. He deflected and kept the energy light and acted like a man who was tired and slightly tipsy and ready to end a good evening with his best friend. It sat back down. He had bought himself 60 seconds. It asked for water. It asked to use his phone to call a ride. Jason understood what was happening. If he said no, he was cornered outside in the dark with something that had spent the better part of an evening cataloging exactly how much he trusted it. Saying yes meant letting it inside. There was no good option. He let it in. It moved through his parents' home with complete familiarity. It knew where the glasses were. It knew the layout of the kitchen. It navigated the space like someone who had been there many times, which Tony had. But this was not Tony. Jason handed over his phone, knowing it was dead. He listened to it have a one-sided conversation from the other room, performing a phone call to a ride that was never coming. Then it came back. They said goodbye at the front door. Easy. Normal. The way a real evening with a real friend would end. But just before it turned to leave, it looked at Jason one final time. A long look, studying, measuring. And as Jason met its eyes in the porch light, he noticed something that made his legs go weak. The green was back. The heterochromia that had been missing all evening was suddenly present, sitting in the center of those brown eyes exactly where it was supposed to be, as if it had forgotten to include it at first, and had just remembered. It raised a hand and walked into the dark. Jason locked every door, every window. He pulled out the few weapons he owned and arranged them in specific spots around his bedroom, where he could reach them quickly from wherever he was standing. He lay down without turning the lights off. He did not sleep for a long time. When morning finally came and he was still breathing, still intact, still in his own house, he reached for his phone to message the real Tony. Their recent messages were gone. The entire thread from the previous day, the text about the hunting trip, the conversation that had started all of this, had been deleted completely. No record of it. He went outside. No vercans. No evidence of a fire in the backyard pit. Nothing to indicate that anyone had sat out there the night before. Except the snow. The perfect, undisturbed snow that had covered the ground when he arrived at the woods the previous day was gone. Every inch of his front and backyard was covered in prints. Hundreds of them. Overlapping, circling, pressing into the ground in every direction. As if something had spent the entire night walking around his house. And in the snow leading away from that mass of prints, a single trail. One set of footsteps, leading back into the woods. Jason followed every rule after that. Locked doors, covered windows. He does not respond to voices he cannot see. He does not call back to sounds coming from the tree line after dark. But the question that has stayed with him, the one he cannot find an answer to, is this. It knew Tony's voice. It knew Tony's laugh. It knew the layout of his parents' home. It knew the right memories to reference, the right things to say, the right way to make him feel comfortable. How long had it been watching? How much does something have to study you before it can become the person you trust most in the world? And here is what I want to know from you. At what point during that evening would you have realized something was wrong? The name slip? The missing tooth detail? The smell? Or would you have made it all the way to the end, said good night, and only understood in the morning when the snow told you the truth? Tell me in the comments, because I think most of us would have let it in.